December 1st, 1991, Herndon, Virginia. The parents of 21-year-old Tommy Burkett return home to find him dead in his bedroom, the apparent victim of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. When police arrive, Tommy's parents are immediately taken aback by their suspicious behavior and notice strange discrepancies to make them think their son did not commit suicide. Upon further investigation, they find evidence to suggest Tommy might have been murdered for doing undercover work with the Drug Enforcement Administration, and that a massive cover-up surrounds his death. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our newest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and yes, our podcast has once again started off with an unfamiliar voice. That was Eve Davis, the winner of our latest contest where listeners can earn a chance to recite the opening narration for one of our episodes, and she did a tremendous job, so thank you very much, Eve. This has become a recurring monthly contest for the podcast, and I will share more details about how you can enter at the end of this episode. Anyway, the case we're featuring today was actually suggested by the winner of last month's voiceover contest, Scott Owings, and it's a great choice because I've been wanting to cover this story for a while. The suspicious 1991 suicide of Tommy Burkett. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries and was one of their many stories about a victim whose death was officially ruled to be a suicide by the authorities, but their loved ones uncovered enough suspicious discrepancies to make them believe there was foul play. Sadly, in some of these cases, it seemed apparent the authorities' original suicide ruling was probably correct, and the victim's family was searching for answers because they were having a hard time dealing with the tragedy. But the death of Tommy Burkett is not one of those stories, because there is a ton of incredibly suspicious stuff surrounding his death to make a compelling case for murder. Both of Tommy's parents fought diligently to keep his case in the spotlight, and unfortunately, they have both since passed away. But I think this definitely deserves a thorough analysis to determine whether it's more likely he really did take his own life or was a victim of foul play. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and shorter minisodes. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the suspicious death of Tommy Burkett. Our story begins in Virginia in 1991. Our central figure is 21-year-old Tommy Burkett, whose parents are Tom Burkett Sr. and Beth George Burkett. The family lives in the town of Herndon, and Tommy is a junior at Marymount University in Arlington, where his mother also works as a part-time instructor. Tommy has returned home for the Thanksgiving holidays, and on Saturday, November 30th, he leaves to visit some friends in Centerville. At 2 a.m. on December 1st, Tommy calls his parents to tell him he will be staying overnight, but says he will return at around noon in order to attend a poetry reading with them that afternoon. After leaving their house at 11:45 a.m. to run an errand, Tom and Beth return home and were surprised to see that Tommy had not shown up yet. They waited around for him until 2:45 p.m., but when Tommy still didn't arrive, they left to attend the poetry reading without him. At 6:10, the Burketts came back home and noticed that Tommy's blue Mustang was now parked in the driveway. Even though they had left the house lights on when they left that afternoon, most of them were now off. When they entered the house, Tom and Beth didn't see any sign of Tommy, so they walked upstairs to his bedroom and were treated to a horrifying sight. Tommy's dead body was sitting upright on the sofa. A .357 Magnum was in Tommy's limp hand, which was resting on his lap, and on the surface, it appeared that he had committed suicide by shooting himself through the mouth. Even though Tom and Beth were absolutely devastated by this, they still managed to notice a bunch of odd things about the scene. Tommy was sitting with his ankles crossed. There were towels surrounding his body in order to help prop him up. His clothing was torn in places, and he also appeared to have cuts and bruises on him. When Beth touched her son's hands, they felt very cold, suggesting Tommy had been dead for quite some time, an idea supported by the fact that the blood on him was now dry. When Tom grabbed the .357 Magnum in Tommy's hand, he noticed that there was one bullet missing, but the gun cylinder had been unlatched, meaning that it would have been impossible for him to fire. Anyway, they called 911, and fire and rescue personnel soon arrived at the scene. When the EMTs examined Tommy, they told his parents that due to the state of rigor mortis in his body, he had likely been dead for several hours. The Fairfax County Police Department then arrived, and a uniformed officer named Darryl McEachern barged through the door and immediately rushed up the stairs at a frantic pace. Without even entering the bedroom and examining the scene, McEachern turned to Tom and Beth and said things like, "Don't blame yourself, college students kill themselves all the time, and there's nothing you could have done." The lead detective, Thomas Lyons, soon entered the bedroom, and this is when things started getting really strange. Detective Lyons emerged a few minutes later carrying a bank deposit slip which he claimed he'd found in Tommy's pocket. He showed it to the Burketts, who saw that the words, "I want to be cremated," were written on there, and Lyons seemed pretty convinced that this was a suicide note. Needless to say, his parents found the whole note really odd and did not believe it was in Tommy's handwriting. And even though the paramedics had just stated that Tommy had likely been dead for several hours, Lyons now told the Burketts that Tommy's death occurred very recently and that he probably shot himself only minutes before they arrived home. It wasn't long before Tommy's body was removed from the house, but no attempt was made by the Fairfax County PD to preserve the bedroom as a potential crime scene. It was not photographed or dusted for prints, no police tape was put up, no attempt was made to examine the blood spatter evidence or perform ballistic tests, and the bullet from the .357 Magnum was not even removed from the bedroom wallboard. Tommy's hands were never tested for gunshot residue, and no attempt was made to examine any part of the house for evidence at all, even though the Burketts noticed signs of disturbance, such as some broken plants in the upstairs balcony area, and some unidentified muddy footprints leading out the back door toward a nearby ravine. Detective Lyons acted very callously toward Tom and Beth, telling them, "One thing we don't do is clean up the mess. You'll have to go up there and clean up." In addition, another officer could apparently be heard laughing while Tommy's body was being moved. When Beth attempted to search Tommy's Mustang in the driveway, Officer McEachern stopped her, claiming that the police already searched the vehicle, which turned out not to be true. No attempt was made to canvass the neighborhood for witnesses, but when witnesses attempted to approach McEachern to provide statements, he brushed them off and told them their statements wouldn't be necessary. Tommy's body was taken away from the house in an ambulance to Fairfax Hospital at 7:06 p.m., but hospital records would list his arrival at 8:30, even though it should not have taken nearly an hour and a half to drive there from the Burkett home. In another strange detail, it would turn out that the destination code for the ambulance on the official report was 14, which happened to be the code for a different military hospital. Since Tommy never served in the military, there would be no reason for his body to go there. Now here's an answer to an important question which many Unsolved Mysteries fans have had after watching the segment about the case. Who was the owner of the .357 Magnum found in Tommy's hand? This key piece of information was not mentioned on Unsolved Mysteries, or most of the news articles, but on a website the Burketts used to maintain, I managed to find a copy of a letter Tom wrote to the FBI, where he confirmed that the gun belonged to him. The .357 Magnum was kept in a drawer inside a closet in Tom's bedroom, which also contained an ammunition safe. Tommy also owned a gun which he often liked to use at the shooting range, and it was kept in a case inside this closet, but it was left untouched, even though one would have to step over this case in order to access the drawer containing the .357 Magnum. So if Tommy did shoot himself, he elected not to use his own gun. The key to the ammunition case was kept inside the closet, and when Tom opened it, he discovered that 6 cartridges for the .357 Magnum were missing from a box. So these were obviously the same bullets found in Tommy's gun, and one of them had been fired. Another major discrepancy that the Burketts noticed was that Tommy's glasses, wallet, and driver's license were missing from the house. The following day, Tom called Tommy's bank to cancel his ATM card, and he learned that it had last been used at an ATM in Centerville shortly after midnight on December 1st. The Burketts would later contact the bank to obtain photos from the ATM's camera, but when Detective Lyons found out about this, he subpoenaed the bank for the security tape and kept it away from the Burketts for 7 months. When Tom and Beth finally obtained the photos of Tommy at the ATM, they noticed 3 white males passing behind Tommy in the background and heading towards his car while Tommy looked in their direction. However, the footage was not clear enough to make out who these 3 males might be. Anyway, 2 days after Tommy's death, Tom and Beth went to his dorm room at Marymount University in order to collect his belongings. It was here that they were approached by the Chief Student Affairs Officer, Linda McMahon. And no, in case you're wondering, this is not the same Linda McMahon who was the wife of World Wrestling Entertainment Chairman Vince McMahon. McMahon handed over Tommy's driver's license to the Burketts and claimed that it had been turned in by another student, but would not reveal who the student was. So Tom and Beth then decided to do what the police never bothered to do: question their neighbors to see if they had seen anything unusual on the day of Tommy's death, and they would hear a number of shocking stories. Numerous witnesses reported seeing Tommy's blue Mustang being chased through the neighborhood by a large dark sedan sometime around noon. In fact, one of the vehicles was seen driving over somebody's lawn at one point. Tom and Beth actually recalled that as they were leaving their house at 11:45 a.m. to run an errand that day, they could hear the sounds of brakes squealing in the distance, though they never actually saw any vehicles. This dark sedan would be spotted in the neighborhood on multiple occasions during the afternoon while Tom and Beth were at the poetry reading. Multiple witnesses remembered seeing the sedan blocking the entrance to the street, and it was parked there for about 20 minutes with a white male inside. The sedan was also parked in front of the Burkett home at around 5:30, though it was unoccupied at that time. In addition, 2 neighbors reported seeing Tommy's Mustang driving down the street at 5:10 without any lights on, before it circled the cul-de-sac and came to a stop in front of the Burkett home. A white male appeared to be behind the wheel, though it was too dark to tell if it was Tommy or not, but he would not exit the vehicle until after the neighbors went back inside their home. But if all this wasn't weird enough, witnesses reported a strange scene when fire and rescue personnel arrived. Shortly after the Burketts called 911, 2 ambulances showed up in the neighborhood, but only one of them actually went to the house. The other ambulance turned onto an adjacent street and parked next to a small ravine located behind the Burkett residence. A couple of people exited the ambulance, went down into the ravine, and were seen retrieving something and carrying it back. After that, the ambulance left the scene without its sirens on and never went to the Burkett residence. I mentioned earlier that Tom and Beth had seen muddy footprints leading from their back door to this ravine, but of course no casts were ever made of these prints. Now, since Tommy's bedroom was never investigated as a crime scene, his parents refused to clean it up and left it exactly as is. They started noticing other strange oddities in their home, such as the fact that their phone books were missing, and some gripping tape had inexplicably been removed from a baseball bat in Tommy's room. It wasn't long before they started noticing what appeared to be blood spatters in other parts of the house, such as a spray of small reddish marks on the wall next to their stairway. Needless to say, it did not make sense for blood to be there if Tommy committed suicide in his bedroom. So Tom and Beth contacted the Fairfax County PD to see if someone would come down to examine the potential blood evidence, but no one ever showed up. They finally decided to hire an independent blood expert from New York, who examined the red marks on the stairway wall and concluded that it was definitely blood, but the samples were not large enough to determine if the blood belonged to Tommy. The fatal bullet which supposedly killed Tommy was finally removed from the bedroom wallboard, but it didn't seem to have any traces of blood or human tissue on it. The original autopsy report was signed by Dr. James Beyer, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner of Northern Virginia, and it stated that Tommy had no visible injuries on him, even though his parents were pretty certain they'd seen some when they discovered his body. Dr. Beyer was also caught in several lies. When the Burketts requested the autopsy photographs, Beyer claimed that the only photo ever taken was a close-up of Tommy's face, even though he had shown multiple photos of the body to Tom on a previous occasion. And even though Tommy's autopsy took place on December 3, 1991, the official report listing his cause of death as a suicide was signed by Dr. Donald Hout, the Fairfax County Medical Examiner, on December 2nd, one day before the autopsy even took place. Not only that, but Dr. Hout also signed Tommy's death certificate on December 3rd, but when compared to his signature on the report from the day before, the handwriting did not appear to match at all. More shadiness ensued when the clothing Tommy wore when he died was turned over to a funeral director, who subsequently decided to burn it, without his parents' knowledge or consent. Well, understandably, Tom and Beth came to the decision to exhume their son's body so that a new autopsy could be performed. Just as they remembered when they found his body, Tommy had multiple cuts and bruises on him, including a large amount of bruising on his right ear, and it also turned out he had a broken jaw. None of these injuries were mentioned at all in Dr. Beyer's autopsy report. The only sign of an exit wound from a gunshot was a small half-inch by quarter-inch hole in the back of Tommy's neck, but it did not have any powder burns or residue and seemed way too small to have been caused by a .357 Magnum. And there were also no signs of gunshot residue on Tommy's hands. The evidence seemed to suggest that Tommy had gotten into some sort of violent struggle before he was killed, so his mother began to wonder if he had made any attempts to call 911. Beth contacted a local 911 dispatcher who searched the logs and found a record of a Tommy Burkett having called them on 2 consecutive occasions on the afternoon of his death. It also showed that a neighbor called 911 on December 1st, providing the Burkett's home address and asking for assistance. It would turn out that Tommy phoned the neighbor and asked them to call 911 because he apparently had trouble getting through. The records also showed that Tommy had called 911 on 2 other occasions in August and October to file a complaint. However, even though Tommy's name was listed, the actual records of why he made these 911 calls had been deleted, so the dispatcher put Beth on hold to check with her supervisor. A few minutes later, the dispatcher returned and claimed the whole thing was an error, and that even though Tommy's name was listed on her computer screen, he never actually did call 911. Given all these suspicious new developments, Beth now started remembering some strange incidents from the weeks preceding Tommy's death, which suddenly took on a whole new significance. On November 12th, Tommy called his mother from his dorm room at Marymount University and frantically told her that someone had broken into his dorm mailbox and stolen his paycheck. At the time, Tommy worked a part-time job at the admissions office on campus, so Beth told him to contact the payroll office to stop payment on the check. But Tommy wasn't worried about the potential loss of money. He seemed more concerned about the wrong person finding something else after breaking into the mailbox. Tommy said, "I'm afraid they found out what I'm doing. It's something I didn't want anyone to know about." But he never actually went into specific details about what he was talking about. Campus security did file a report for Tommy about the theft and told him that they'd contact the Arlington Police Department to investigate, but it turned out they never did this. Beth also remembered an incident which took place shortly after Tommy's phone call, where she was approached on campus by 3 students who apparently recognized her as Tommy's mother. One of them told Beth to tell Tommy that there were 3 guys waiting to beat him up. Beth would later find out that the threat was made by Philip Howley, who happened to be the son of a DEA agent, and one of the other students was his roommate, Donald Adam McEwen, whose grandmother was a wealthy member of the Board of Trustees at Marymount University. The two of them had reportedly been harassing Tommy throughout most of the fall semester, and witnesses would later inform Beth that sometime after midnight on November 16th, Tommy was attacked by Howley without provocation at a party. Later that night, Tommy went to confront Howley in his dorm room, where he was severely beaten and left with a very swollen face. On their website, the Burketts posted letters they'd written listing many of the incidents of harassment Tommy faced in the weeks preceding his death, which included an alleged sexual assault which took place in a dormitory bathroom, though the names of the alleged perpetrators were redacted. Once again, Tommy reported Howley's assault to campus security, who told him they'd informed the Arlington PD, but once again, they failed to do so, even though the actual school literature from Marymount specifically states that police must be contacted whenever an assault occurs on campus. When the Burketts requested copies of this incident report about Tommy's assault, the director of campus security refused to provide it, stating they were not going to hurt the reputations of the other students who were involved in this. In fact, at one point, the assistant dean of students had told the Burketts that it was Tommy who instigated the fight, even though this contradicted eyewitness accounts. Oh, and it also turned out that Philip Howley was the student who turned in Tommy's driver's license before it was given to his parents by Linda McMahon. Before she spoke with them, McMahon had reportedly been telling the college staff not to talk to the Burketts. Tom and Beth made an attempt to speak with the school's board of trustees to address these issues, but they refused to meet with them or provide any assistance. So what could have been the reason for so many different people stonewalling the Burketts? Well, after hearing from several different sources, most of them anonymous, Tom and Beth came to believe that their son had secretly been working undercover as a paid informant with the Drug Enforcement Administration in order to help them with an investigation involving a group of students dealing drugs on campus at Marymount University. And as you'll recall, Philip Howley's father just happened to be a DEA agent. If true, this could have explained the harassment Tommy faced on campus during the last few weeks of his life. At least one informant told the Burketts that on the afternoon of December 1st, Tommy was chased to his neighborhood and had his car run off the road. When Tommy climbed out of his vehicle, his pursuers proceeded to assault him, but Tommy managed to flee and make it back to his house. After Tommy made some failed attempts to call 911, his tormentors entered the house and proceeded to beat him to death with a baseball bat from his bedroom, which would account for why the gripping tape from the bat had been removed. The attackers also used phone books to minimize bruising and absorb blood spatters, which would explain why the phone books turned up missing from the home. Whoever was responsible then staged a fake suicide scene to make it look like Tommy had shot himself. However, the DEA officially denied all allegations that Tommy was working as an informant for them, and like everyone else, were not exactly cooperative with the Burketts. Beth did meet with some DEA agents on a few occasions, and while they denied using Tommy as an informant, she was taken aback by their willingness to admit that they would use undercover student informants to orchestrate drug busts on campus rather than trained agents, even though this could potentially put the student's life in danger. The Burketts continued their fight to reopen the investigation into their son's death, constantly writing letters to senators, congressmen, even the governor of Virginia, but didn't have much luck. They lobbied to have the FBI look into the Fairfax County PD's actions, and after an 18-month investigation which could best be described as half-assed, the FBI concluded that Tommy's death was a suicide, yet refused to let the Burketts see the file they had amassed on him. Whenever people did try to help the Burketts, such as journalists who were publishing articles about the case, they claimed they often found themselves receiving anonymous, threatening phone calls. And there's one more unexpected postscript to this story. You might have heard of the case of Vince Foster, who was the deputy White House counsel to Bill Clinton during his first term as president, before he died of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound in July of 1993. Even though multiple investigations have concluded that Foster committed suicide, there have always been conspiracy theories surrounding his death, but that's a totally different story for another time. What's interesting here is that James Byer, the same deputy chief medical examiner who performed Tommy's initial autopsy, also conducted an autopsy on Vince Foster and concluded that his death was a suicide due to the presence of abundant gunpowder residue in the wound and the absence of trauma to Foster's jaw. Fair enough, but the problem was that there was an absence of gunpowder residue in Tommy's wound and a large amount of trauma to Tommy's jaw. Another weird contradiction is that Foster was shot with a .38, which isn't as powerful as a .357 Magnum, yet the exit wound in the back of Foster's head was 1.5 inch by 1.25 inch, which is a lot larger than the 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch hole in the back of Tommy's neck. So with such noticeable differences between the two deaths, how could Beyer conclude with the same suicide ruling for both of them? Another case which put Byers' credibility into question was the 1989 death of a young man named Timothy Easley. This case also happened to be investigated by Detective Thomas Lyons, and after performing the autopsy, Beyer concluded that Easley's death was a suicide. But 4 years later, this ruling turned out to be false when Easley's girlfriend confessed to killing him and was convicted of the crime. Unfortunately, in spite of these troubling inconsistencies, the Burketts failed to overturn the suicide ruling for Tommy, but they would not give up. They founded an organization called Parents Against Corruption and Cover-Up, and for years had a website devoted to their case at thepacc.org, which is the source of much of the information you've heard on this episode. Unfortunately, the website is no longer active, but you can still look it up using the Wayback Machine. As part of the work with their organization, the Burketts started the Cover-Up Quilt Project, in which the names of 176 victims of suspicious deaths which were never properly investigated, including Tommy's, were stitched onto 18 memorial quilts and put on display at the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building. Unfortunately, Tom and Beth's constant battling took a major toll on them. Beth succumbed to cancer in 2003, and Tom passed away only 3 years later, with both of their deaths taking place before they reached the age of 60. Since they are no longer with us, the investigation into Tommy Burkett's death has ground to a dead halt, so we still don't know the full truth about whether he actually committed suicide or was a victim of foul play. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Wow, this is just one of those cases where the implications of what took place are enough to make your brain explode. For one thing, it seems clear that no matter what happened, Tommy Burkett's parents were the victims of a horrible injustice, and even if he really did commit suicide, they deserve to be treated a hell of a lot better. On the other hand, their murder scenario almost seems too big to be true. I'm definitely willing to believe there was foul play involved, and that there was a cover-up, but with everything Tom and Beth dug up, this cover-up appears to involve the Fairfax County Police Department, the DEA, the FBI, state officials, prominent medical examiners, Fairfax County Fire and Rescue, 911 dispatchers, and the administration of Marymount University. Why would all these people orchestrate and maintain such a massive conspiracy over the death of a seemingly ordinary 21-year-old kid? I think the one fact which seems indisputable is that regardless of whether Tommy's death was suicide or murder, there was some really terrible police work on display here. Even if they weren't trying to cover something up, it's pretty negligent that the Fairfax County PD would not even attempt to preserve the crime scene and immediately jump to the conclusion of suicide without doing their due diligence and pursuing other leads. Not to mention that they acted pretty callously towards parents who had just lost a child. For the Unsolved Mysteries segment, the Fairfax County PD assigned Major Art Mabry to be their spokesperson and do an interview on their behalf. And, well, I don't think they could have found a worse representative if they tried. Mabry has got to be one of the most shifty, awkward, and uncomfortable-looking interviewees ever featured on that show, and he looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. On their Parents Against Corruption and Cover-Up website, the Burketts have an entire page devoted to poking holes in every single statement Mabry made. I understand that not everyone's going to be adept at speaking in front of a TV camera, but this guy's supposed to be your spokesperson, and he does a pretty terrible job at getting you to side with the police on this one. All that being said, I have to be objective here and explore every angle, including the possibility that Tommy really did commit suicide. Tommy's parents present a scenario with their son being assaulted and harassed at Marymount University because he was supposedly a secret undercover informant for the DEA who was ultimately killed because he knew too much. I have no doubt that Tommy really did suffer this abuse on campus, But when you take away all the rumors involving drugs, this does seem like it could be a case of a young man being bullied mercilessly for months until he finally reached his breaking point and chose to take his own life. Sadly, you've probably heard a lot of stories like this about young students being so overwhelmed by nonstop bullying and harassment that they decide to commit suicide. I have to say, whenever I watched the Unsolved Mystery segment, I was always bothered by the fact that they never explained where the gun in Tommy's hand originally came from. This sort of thing has actually happened on more than one occasion on the show. They've presented a few cases where a person allegedly shot themselves in their home and their family was convinced they were murdered, but the segment will neglect to mention if the victim or their family actually owned a gun. You get the impression that the gun did belong to them, but the show is intentionally leaving out that piece of info in order to add more mystery and bolster the murder theory. Like I mentioned earlier, the one source where I was finally able to learn the origin of Tommy's gun was a letter his father wrote to the FBI, which confirmed that the .357 Magnum was kept in a drawer in their bedroom closet, and that a key had been used to unlock the ammunition case and load the gun with 6 bullets. Now, this opens up some problematic unanswered questions. If Tommy was murdered by someone who wanted to make his death look like a suicide, would an outsider even know about where to find the .357 Magnum and the ammunition safe? Well, here's another interesting tidbit I found on the Parents Against Corruption and Cover-Up website. On one page, the Burketts state that Donald Adam McEwen, one of the students allegedly harassing Tommy on campus, was, and I quote, "the only person in the world other than our family who knew where the gun, ammunition, and keys were kept," unquote. Unfortunately, there is no further explanation for this, because I'd really like to know why they're so certain that McEwen would have known this information. With all the info there is out there about this case, one thing which has never been made clear to me is what kind of social life Tommy had. I always got the impression that Tommy seemed like something of a loner, which might have made him an ideal target for bullies. McEwen was the friend and roommate of Tommy's worst tormentor, Philip Howley, and it sounds like he actively participated in the harassment. But was McEwen friends with Tommy at one point? Did McEwen ever visit the Burkett home prior to Tommy's death and get shown the location of the ammunition safe in the closet? It would be really helpful to know the answers to these questions. I guess the alternative explanation is that if Tommy was being chased, he retrieved the gun and the bullets in order to defend himself, but was subsequently overpowered, and his killers decided to use the gun in order to stage a suicide. It sounds like Tom Burkett found it strange that Tommy wouldn't have used his own personal gun to commit suicide. Instead of retrieving his gun from a case inside the closet, Tommy stepped over it in order to grab the .357 Magnum from the drawer. But if Tommy was running for his life and needed a weapon to defend himself, he might have simply found it easier to grab the .357 Magnum in the heat of the moment, rather than attempt to open the case. And if Tommy wanted to kill himself, it doesn't make sense for him to retrieve 6 bullets from the ammunition case to load the gun, since 1 bullet would have been enough to do the job. On the other hand, it also doesn't make sense for someone to load the gun with 6 bullets in order to stage Tommy's suicide. So I think this would lend credence to the idea that Tommy retrieved the ammo and loaded the gun himself for his own protection, but never got the chance to use it. After looking at all the forensic evidence, the Burketts seemed convinced that Tommy was beaten to death with a baseball bat, rather than being shot. The hole in the back of his neck seemed too small to have been made with a .357 Magnum bullet, and there wasn't enough blood or tissue evidence to suggest he'd been shot through the mouth, nor were there any signs of gunpowder burns or residue. So the implication seems to be that someone fired 1 bullet into the wallboard and then placed the gun in Tommy's hand to make it look like suicide, though I do find it odd that they would not actually fire the bullet through Tommy's mouth in order to make his self-inflicted gunshot wound look more convincing. Another suspicious detail is that Tommy's parents claim the gun's cylinder was unlatched, which would have made it impossible for him to fire it, though to be fair, by his own admission, Tom did handle the gun after he found it, and could have conceivably unlatched the cylinder by accident. If that's what happened, you certainly couldn't blame Tom, since this was a highly emotional situation for him, and considering the police's non-existent effort at preserving the crime scene, it likely wouldn't have made much difference anyway. Now obviously, there is evidence to suggest that a lot more went on inside that house than a simple suicide. There appeared to be blood spatters in other places beside the bedroom, and Tommy had a broken jaw and a seriously injured right ear. Not to mention the eyewitness sightings of Tommy's Mustang being chased through the neighborhood by an unidentified black sedan. But if you want to look at a possible alternate theory, what if Tommy was legitimately chased to his house and severely beaten by his tormentors, which would account for the blood spatters and Tommy's additional injuries, such as his broken jaw? However, his attackers then left the house without actually killing him, but the incident causes Tommy to reach his breaking point and decide he can't take it anymore, so he decides to visit his parents' closet, grab the nearest gun, and shoot himself in his bedroom. However, I do agree that it seems unlikely that Tommy's body would still be in an upright position if this had occurred, and there are a lot of things about the subsequent police investigation which raise some major red flags, but I'll get into that momentarily. First, I want to address one other piece of information about this case I've never been able to understand. In some of the news articles I've read about this case, the Burketts seem to express their belief that a second person other than Tommy was also killed in their house that day. This person was apparently shot, which might explain some of the other blood spatters in the house, and then they subsequently ran out the back door, collapsed, and died several hundred feet away from the house before their body was taken away from the scene. Unfortunately, the Burketts never went into specific details about this. Was this second person deliberately targeted for murder, or did Tommy possibly get off a shot while defending himself and manage to kill one of his attackers? I think one of the reasons the Burketts believe a second person was killed was because of the muddy footprints leading out the back door towards a ravine behind the house. And remember, witnesses claim they saw an extra ambulance stop near this location, and a group of people went down the ravine to retrieve something before the ambulance left the scene. Now, I have my doubts that they were retrieving a dead body, because that probably would have been noticed, but the implication seems to be that a crucial piece of evidence was left down there which had to be retrieved. No one knows what happened to this extra ambulance, but the ambulance that did stop at the Burkett residence and transported Tommy's body took nearly an hour and a half to arrive at the hospital. Since it shouldn't have taken near that long to get there, you could easily infer that they were using this time to dispose of evidence. But if a second person was killed in the Burkett residence, who could it have been? Because if someone connected to Tommy just happened to be killed or go missing around the exact same time he died, people would have noticed, and I just don't see how this wouldn't have attracted any attention. All that being said, if the eyewitness sightings of the ambulance at the ravine are accurate, then that is really, really odd, so I do believe that something incriminating had to be down there. Now let's talk about the strange behavior of the police when they arrived at the scene, as it seems they had already predetermined they were going to declare Tommy's death a suicide before they even saw his body. That alleged suicide note which Detective Lyons found on the deposit slip is absolutely ridiculous. I know people who commit suicide sometimes do strange things, as you can never predict what frame of mind they're going to be in at the time, but I just don't see how a suicidal young man who seems to have a close relationship with his parents is going to write out the words, "I want to be cremated," and nothing else before they decide to end their life. The note looked like it had been scrawled out on the nearest piece of paper 2 minutes before Tommy's parents saw it, and it would not surprise me at all if that's what happened. The note couldn't have looked any more fake if it read, "I totally was not murdered, you guys." Now, the Burketts' account of the police's behavior that night is pretty horrifying, but I will concede that the source of a lot of these stories was their own website, and they don't have any independent corroboration. I will concede that maybe this wasn't a deliberate cover-up, but just a simple case of a lazy police force seeing a scene which looked like suicide on the surface and deciding to close the case because they didn't want to do any investigative work. But even so, who tells parents of an alleged suicide victim that they'll have to clean up the mess themselves? Regardless of whether it's a homicide or a suicide, aren't there professional cleaning crews who are responsible for something like that? We know the Burketts have to be telling the truth about this part, because they refused to clean up Tommy's bedroom in order to preserve it as a crime scene. Good police investigators will tell you that you should always treat every death as a potential homicide until the evidence points towards suicide or accident, but in this case, the Fairfax County PD did the exact opposite of that, and it's inexcusable that they didn't even follow basic standard procedure and seal off the scene. And it would be one thing if the police were too lazy to canvass the neighborhood and question the neighbors, but some neighbors flat out approached them that night in order to make a statement and were just brushed off. Apparently, one of the neighbors who saw Tommy's Mustang driving down the street at 5:10 p.m. approached Officer McEachern with this information, and he tried to convince them they gotten the time wrong. I get the sense that Tommy was already dead at 5:10, and the neighbor saw someone else driving his Mustang. I think the driver sensed he was being watched, which is why he refused to leave the vehicle until the neighbors went inside. It's very odd that Detective Lyons would try to say Tommy died only minutes before his parents got home, even after the paramedics stated he'd been dead for hours. But Lyons probably overheard the neighbor telling McEachern that she saw Tommy's Mustang at 5:10. Since it would have been impossible for Tommy to be driving his car at that time if he was already dead, Lyons probably felt the need to plant the idea in the Burkett's head that Tommy was still alive until a few minutes past 6 o'clock. And of course, even though Lyons didn't want to do any actual police work on the night Tommy's body was found, he was certainly quick to leap into action once he found out the Burketts were trying to obtain photos of Tommy at the ATM in Centerville. It's so weird he would feel compelled to subpoena the security tape if this was just an open and shut case of suicide. Under normal circumstances, I might not put much significance into those ATM photos, but the fact that Lyons went to such lengths to keep them away from the Burketts makes me think that those three males approaching Tommy in the background were involved in what happened to him. I'm trying to figure out how these events might have unfolded. The photos were taken shortly after midnight, and Tommy phoned his parents at 2 a.m. to tell them he wasn't returning home until noon, and they found it pretty unusual that he would call at such a late hour. This is technically the last time Tommy's parents ever heard from him, but the last independent eyewitness sightings of Tommy are of him being chased through his neighborhood in his Mustang. If the accounts are true that Tommy was run off the road by a dark sedan and had to escape to his house on foot, this would explain why Tommy's Mustang was seen being driven to his house at 5:10 p.m. If Tommy wasn't driving the vehicle at that time, then someone probably had to retrieve it from the spot where Tommy abandoned it in order to park it in the driveway. This might also account for why Officer McEachern was so insistent that Beth not check inside the Mustang that night and lied to her about the police already having searched it. I wish there were more details about the friends Tommy went to see in Centerville, and if they could account for Tommy's whereabouts after he was photographed at the ATM. Because if he was accosted by those three males while he was there, where was he during the next 12 hours or so? Apparently, Tommy had saved up over $1,000 in his bank account from painting houses over the summer, but at the time of his death, his account was down to only $47. It's been rumored that the people harassing Tommy on campus that semester often extorted money from him, so this might provide a potential explanation for why Tommy was being shadowed at an ATM. There are some timeline issues here, since Tom and Beth thought they heard brakes squealing when they originally left the house at 11:45 a.m. to run an errand, which implied that the chase between Tommy's Mustang and the dark sedan was already taking place. However, the Burketts soon returned to their house and remained there until 2:45 without noticing anything suspicious, so Tommy probably hadn't arrived there yet. So what were his exact whereabouts during this time period? Whatever the circumstances, it seems pretty likely that Tommy was the victim of non-stop bullying and harassment during his final semester at Marymount University, and that the school really dropped the ball at handling the situation. Sadly, this type of thing is not uncommon, as I'm sure you've heard numerous stories of colleges and universities attempting to cover up sexual assaults and deal with them internally rather than involving the police, as they don't want to give off the impression their campus is a violent, unsafe place and discourage potential students from enrolling there. If Tommy's harassment actually did cross the line into sexual assault, as it has been alleged, then I could see why Marymount would try to hide this, particularly if the grandson of a Board of Trustees member might be linked to the whole situation. But the big question seems to be, was Tommy's death the result of nonstop bullying? Or was he killed because he was actually working as an informant for the DEA? I think there's always been some confusion about the section of the Unsolved Mystery segment where Tommy's paycheck is stolen from his mailbox. The way they presented it, it almost sounded like Tommy was paranoid because the paycheck revealed that he was working with the DEA, but I kinda doubt that the DEA is going to be paying their undercover informants by sending them checks through the mail. So to clarify, the stolen paycheck was for another job Tommy worked on campus, but it sounds like he was worried about something more incriminating being found. In other words, stealing the paycheck was just a cover, and whoever broke into the mailbox was actually searching for something else. Tommy never specified what they might have found, but he seemed pretty concerned about it. However, it must be said that Tommy never actually told his parents he was working with the DEA, as the Burketts only learned this rumor after speaking to other sources. Now, it's not impossible that Tommy could have found himself in a situation like that. You might be familiar with the story of Andrew Sadek, a 20-year-old college student who was arrested for selling marijuana and agreed to act as a confidential informant for law enforcement in order to avoid a potentially serious prison sentence. He was eventually found dead of a gunshot wound to the head, and even though the police labeled his death as suicide, Andrew's parents believe he was murdered, and that working as an informant put his life in danger. So if Tommy did work with the DEA, I can see a similar scenario where he's caught for something minor like marijuana possession, so in order to avoid jail time, he agrees to be an undercover informant and help bring down a drug dealing operation taking place on Marymount campus. From what I read about Beth's meetings with the DEA, they didn't seem to have many qualms about this type of undercover operation, even though it could potentially put an untrained student's life at serious risk. If this type of situation happened with Tommy, and he wound up dead for it, then I can see why everyone involved might feel compelled to cover it up. I think it would all hinge on the fact that Philip Howley's father was a DEA agent, and if Howley himself was dealing drugs and implicated in the sting operation, all hell might have broken loose, leading to an extensive conspiracy to get rid of Tommy and keep everything under wraps. But man, this whole scenario just seems larger than life. The idea that members of the DEA, Fairfax PD, FBI, and the administration of Marymount University could all manage to keep this conspiracy afloat without the entire house of cards crashing down. However, if you go to the Parents Against Corruption and Cover-Up website, it's just unbelievable the amount of resistance the Burketts had to face just to get anyone to conduct a simple basic investigation and show a little transparency. I mean, I don't know what kind of DEA agent Philip Howley's father was, but was this guy powerful enough to convince so many people to orchestrate such a massive cover-up? I mean, you could possibly write off some of the Burketts' accusations as conspiracy paranoia, or just a stubborn unwillingness to accept that their son committed suicide, but they often provided documentation to back their points. For example, their website showcases a comparison between Dr. Donald Hout's signature on the official medical examiner's report and his signature on Tommy's death certificate, and the handwriting is clearly different, so it's obvious that someone forged his signature on the report, and I just don't think anyone would go to that trouble unless they had a vested interest in preventing a murder investigation. I know there are plenty of cases out there where it seems apparent that a suicide victim's family are grasping at straws and building up a non-existent conspiracy in order to avoid facing the fact that someone they love chose to take their own life, but there are just so many suspicious details about Tommy's death that I can't imagine it's just a simple suicide. You could come up with logical explanations to explain some of the strange stuff in this case, but there's just too much weirdness which can't be accounted for, so at the very least, the Burketts were owed a full-fledged investigation into their son's death. Now, even though I believe Tommy was murdered, I'm still on the fence about how it might have happened. It's certainly possible that Tommy was working undercover for the DEA, but this might also be a case of bullying which got so far out of control that his tormentors wound up causing his death. But if Philip Howley and Donald Adam McEwen were responsible, they still had very influential, well-connected family members who would have had the means to orchestrate a cover-up and ensure Tommy's death would be labeled a suicide and swept under the rug. When you have one potential suspect whose father is a DEA agent and another whose grandmother is on the board of trustees at Marymount, then it's not out of the realm of possibility that law enforcement and an educational institution would both be complicit in covering up the truth. But what they didn't expect was that Tommy's parents were very strong-willed people who would not let their son's case die, so it sounds like whoever was responsible kept trying to stay one step ahead of the Burketts to ensure their investigation wouldn't get anywhere. I just find this whole concept of losing a loved one under suspicious circumstances and being stonewalled and unable to find out what actually happened to be absolutely terrifying, and I can't imagine how helpless Tom and Beth must have felt at times. But God bless them, they would not stop fighting, though unfortunately, this may have taken years off their lives, which is why they're no longer with us. Sadly, it is fairly common for parents of young people who die or go missing under suspicious circumstances to pass away at fairly young ages, as I imagine the stress of the whole ordeal takes a major toll on them. What I haven't mentioned yet is that Tommy also has an older sister named Amy. I don't know too much about her, but she has lost her entire family under tragic circumstances. I don't know if she's still actively searching for answers in Tommy's death, but if she isn't, I wouldn't blame her for moving on, as this whole situation has caused a ton of grief for everyone. But I'm fairly confident that Tommy was a victim of foul play, as there's no way there would be this many suspicious discrepancies if he simply took his own life. There is a bunch more outrageous stuff about this case which I haven't even mentioned, because we would be here for hours, but if you want to learn more information, make sure to use the Wayback Machine and type in the URL thepacc.org to read all the material the Burketts have assembled on their website. With everything I've told you, I don't know if this will get you anywhere, but if by chance you happen to have any information on the death of Tommy Burkett, please contact the appropriate authorities. Once again, I'd like to thank Eve Davis for her terrific job at reciting the opening of this episode, and like I mentioned in the intro, I have now made it a recurring monthly contest for one of our listeners to win the opportunity to do the same thing. If you've already entered the contest before, you are still eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter this contest and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on the podcast. So once again, send an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. We also have a new donor this week named Beatrice, so thank you very much, Beatrice. And in case you haven't heard, we finally opened up an online store for The Trail Went Cold and are now selling merchandise like t-shirts, mugs, and stickers. You can find it by visiting our website trailwentcold.com, where we have a new store button. I definitely think that Trail Went Cold merchandise would make an ideal Christmas present for any true crime or podcast buffs you know. Just wanted to give another big shout out to all my supporters from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide my thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group, so if you feel like discussing the podcast or the cases we feature with myself and your fellow listeners, feel free to join, and I'll approve your entry into the group ASAP. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold.